So let's start with the first part, when Socrates defends himself against the charges. And the defense that he mounts is essentially, boils down to, I'm going to tell you why you don't like me and why I am sitting here. That's essentially his defense. That's how he sort of justifies himself. The first point he makes is that he is not a sophist. Now, from the word sophist, we get the word sophistry, which is the idea of to use empty words, right? Sophistry is using words to no effect. So in other words, if your argument is bad, you try and speak through the weakness of your argument. We'd call that sophistry. The idea of sophistry then comes from the notion of the sophists. Sophists were people in ancient Greece, and later on even through the Roman Empire, who went around and essentially taught people how to speak, right? How to speak well. We might think of it today as people who teach public speaking, people who teach public presentation skills. Today, modern sophists would probably be found in classes on how to write effective PowerPoint presentations and deliver compelling elevator pitches. But the idea of the sophist in its social context was their role was to tell people how to use words to good effect. The reason that matters, particularly in an Athenian context, was if Athens, the city of Athens, practiced what we might call a radical form of democracy, in which the executive, known as the bouleon, the executive authority in Athens, was constantly being cycled through different citizens. So, for example, it is estimated that perhaps up to 50% of all male citizens of Athens, I shouldn't say male citizens, that's redundant, to be a citizen of Athens meant you had property and you were a man, right? You had to satisfy those two conditions, have property and have a man. No female citizens, in fact, will see the attitude towards women in ancient Greece and indeed in this text in due course. It's estimated that something like half of all citizens of Athens at one point or another held the executive position in the city. If you have a position of executive authority, meaning you have the opportunity to make decisions and allocate resources and so on, what's going to be an important skill to have in a democratic context to make that decision-making position valuable to you? What's a good way to convince people that you're right? Strong speaking skills, right? And so this notion of what later Aristotle would call rhetoric is considered to be a kind of key art of not sort of political life, but a key facet of citizenship itself. To be a good citizen was to be someone who was well-versed in the arts of knowledge and of speaking. And so there was an entire class of people who would go around essentially as entrepreneurs selling their educational skills to people who then needed to acquire this capacity to speak. The problem, of course, with the sophist then as a social agent, as somebody who's going around teaching people how to speak, is that the emphasis then is not put on truth. The emphasis is not put on justice. The emphasis is put on what? Speaking well to convince other people, right? Turning your own self-interest into action by virtue of your capacity to convince others, to speak well. If your self-interest is coincident with larger goals of justice, that's fine. But if your self-interest is, for example, to get your neighbor's land at a cheaper price and to somehow convince everybody that this is a good idea and you can talk them round to it, that may be unjust. The point is that the skills taught by sophists are not necessarily the same as the larger public interest, right? They're essentially saying, here's a way for you to perfect your own ability to represent yourself without at the same time teaching or explaining the question of larger civic goals, the larger sort of question of social good. So by attacking Socrates as a sophist, what essentially they are saying is, you are somebody who is using your knowledge, using your wisdom to go around and teach other people how essentially to advocate for their own self-interest more effectively over and against what might be the larger public interest, right? That's essentially the sting of the charge of sophistry. Wisdom that you can buy. And it is worth noting, and he mentions in the text itself at 19c, a very famous play. Some of you may in fact have already read it as part of your studies hitherto. The famous play by a Greek playwright named Aristophanes called The Clouds, in which Socrates appears as a character. This was a play that was written some 20 or 25 years before the trial, in which Socrates appears as a character in Aristophanes' play The Clouds as a kind of untethered philosopher whose head is literally in the figurative clouds, who's not connected to the issues of justice of the day and the like. So in other words, Socrates already had this reputation in Athens as somebody who was interested in the sort of pursuit of ideas for their own sake without linking them back to these questions of what was good for the city. And we see him make reference to this in his trial, saying, you already have this idea about me. It's been long established that you have this impression of me, right? That this reputation that I have explains in part why you have brought me here to trial. He himself then goes out of his way to explain why he is not one of these sophists. In fact, he himself says he is not a sophist, but he's doing something entirely different. And that the wisdom of sophistry, the wisdom of the sophist, is not, in fact, Socratic wisdom. But the fact is that in general, in terms of the reputation, by lumping him together with these people, give him a bad name, as it were, right? Sort of linking him to somebody else. But in the trial, he says, you don't like me. I will explain why you don't like me. You call me a sophist as a kind of a slander against me. But in fact, that is not who I am. And then he launches into this defense, which is that Socrates then explains in this very famous passage why he is not, in fact, a sophist, because the sophist claims wisdom and then exchanges that wisdom across a market for money to then teach people how to become skilled in the art of speaking. Is that, in fact, the wisdom that Socrates claims for himself? And indeed, as we see in his text, or as we see in his defense, Socrates tells the Athenian jury, in fact, by calling me a sophist, it shows that you have almost no understanding of the kind of wisdom that I represent. For I represent a very different form of knowledge, of learning. I am the exact opposite of a sophist, someone who claims knowledge and is willing to impart it for money. I, in fact, am the reverse, and he defends it at the end of his discussion. For example, 23c, he says, you need look no further than my poverty. I'm an extremely poor man, right? Sophists are not poor men. They're quite wealthy because of this capacity for them to earn a wage, and I am poor. And so he distinguishes then his wisdom from this sophist wisdom, and is perhaps the most famous element of the entire text. So let's go through it. He tells the story at 21a through to 23c or thereabouts of a good friend of his whose name is Chaerephon. And Chaerephon makes a journey that many people in ancient Greece made, many Athenians made, to a very nearby site that's situated not far from Athens, called the Oracle at Delphi. So if you know the word of oracular or oracular wisdom, it derives from this notion of the oracle, of the oracles in the ancient world, of which the Oracle at Delphi was the most famous. What is an Oracle of Delphi? Well, he doesn't explain it because he assumes that everybody knows, but you may not know, so I will briefly tell you. An oracle, the idea of an oracle, it is essentially a temple, like a church, a temple to the gods, where presided over by, in this case, priestesses, female priests. And the idea is you can go there and you can consult the gods. You can ask the gods a question, and the gods will respond, and that way you will gain some wisdom of the gods. The gods have eternal wisdom, right? In the case of the Oracle at Delphi, it is the god Apollo, the god of the sun. And so the idea is you can go there, pay money, the priest will take your question, consult the gods, and come back with the answer. The idea, this was a way to solicit the opinion of the gods. So typically you'd go there and you'd say, will I have more children? Will next year the crops be good? Should I grow this or that kind of thing. So he has a friend of his whose name is Chaerephon, and Chaerephon visits the oracle and has a question for the oracle. And the question he asks, right, is, who is the wisest man in Athens, right? And the oracle answers that the wisest man in Athens is Socrates himself. So Chaerephon comes back to Athens, runs into Socrates, and I took a trip up to Athens, day trip, packed the wife, the car, some sandwiches, went up there. Anyway, turns out you are the wisest man in Athens. And this confuses Socrates a great deal. Why? Because Socrates feels he has no wisdom. So how can someone who feels he has no wisdom possibly be the wisest man in a city full of wise people? In other words, the oracular declaration, what the oracle said, makes no sense to name, of all people, Socrates the wisest man. He says, I am conscious, at 21b, I am conscious that I am not wise, not at all wise, either much or little. Surely, therefore, the oracle is wrong. How do you disprove the oracle? All you need to do is go find someone who is wiser than you, and thereby showing that the oracular pronouncement is incorrect. Look, this person's wiser than me, the oracle got it wrong. That would be quite something if you could show that, because then that would throw into question all of the oracular pronouncements. And that's what then Socrates sets out to do. He calls it an investigation at 21b. He says, what does the god mean, and what riddle is he propounding? In other words, what is this mystery that he is putting forward? And so he says, with great reluctance, I proceeded to investigate somewhat as follows, right? I proceeded to investigate what the oracle meant as follows. How do you prove that you are not the wisest person? You need to find somebody else who is wiser than you. So it makes sense then to go around to all the people who have a reputation for what? For wisdom. And the people who have the reputation for wisdom that he specifies in the text, three groups of people. The people who control power, the politicians, right? The poets, we'll come to them in a moment. And the people who do stuff, the people who get things done, the artisans, the people who make things, right? If you think about it, that's the sort of important elements of society, right? The people who sort of structure political life, the people who get things done, and the role of the poets. And let's explain a moment why the poets matter a great deal. Because at the moment when we think of poetry, we think of somebody, I don't know, wearing a beret and a turtleneck, drinking coffee, thinking about love, probably somewhere in deep poverty. But that is not the role of the poet in ancient Greek society. If we wanted to translate the term poet into something to make sense today, we might choose the word historian, or we might even choose the word media, because the role of the poets was to collect, record, and guard the traditions and the history of the society. They were, as it were, representatives of social or collective memory. And the idea would be, and if you know Homer's Iliad or those famous Greek epic poems, the idea was that the poets would go around and they would recite this poetry out loud. If you've read your Homer, what is the Homeric tale? What is it about? It is about the history of you, who you are, how you came to be, where you come from, the great stories of your past. So in other words, the poets are not just sort of random people talking about abstract truths. They are the guardians of the knowledge that explains who you are, how you got here, and why you are the way you are, right? That's the role of the poets. So if you go to the poets, what essentially you're doing is you are interrogating the people who are responsible for all of the customs and traditions of your society. In other words, important people. What does he find when he goes and he talks to all these different people? When he goes and he talks to the politicians? Let's choose the politicians and read it together because it's good fun at 21c. He talks to a famous politician. He says, I was thinking that there, if anywhere, I should prove the utterance of the oracle wrong and will show the oracle, look, this man is smarter than me. But you told me that I was the smartest, so you're wrong. So examining this man, note the word examining. You go to the politician's house, you say, can I come in? He offers you some beverage, you sit down, and now what do? You examine him, right? As a doctor might examine a patient, or you sit down and ask him a set of questions. Examining this man, and I won't name him, and the reason he doesn't want to name him is he doesn't want to embarrass him publicly, but it was one of the public men with regard to whom I had this kind of experience, men of Athens, and conversing with him, this man seemed to me to seem to be wise to many other people, and especially to himself, but not to be so. Meaning, he thought he knew lots of stuff, other people thought he knew lots of stuff, and he himself was convinced he knew lots of stuff, but in fact, he was not very wise at all. That's Socrates' conclusion. Okay, so far so good. If secretly deep down you're thinking, okay, this guy thinks he's the smartest fucker in the room, but I don't think he's all that, that's okay. What should you not do if you want to maintain friendly relations? Tell them to their face. You're just an idiot, you know. And what does he say? And then I tried to show him, right? And then I made it clear, I don't think you're very wise, right? I tried to show him. Now you can imagine if you go around to all the important people in town, sit down, come to their house, beg upon their hospitality, force them into some kind of extensive interrogation in which you ask them this and that and the other thing, what do you think about this? And at the end of it, you say, you're an idiot. What's your reputation going to be? Not particularly good, right? And so it says, from there I went to somebody else, and then from somebody else, and so on. And he says, I became hateful to them, right? I became hateful to them. He says this at 21e. After this, I went on from one to another, perceiving that I was hated and grieving and fearing, but nevertheless, I thought I must consider the God's business of highest importance. And so I had to go investigating the meaning of the oracle to all those who were reputed to know anything. In other words, a kind of oracular mandate. It's like, I'm here on the business of the oracle, I'd like to talk to you, and at the end of it, you come away with this conclusion that this person who thinks they're smart is in fact pretty dumb, or doesn't know what they think they know. And I think that's the important part. It's not only that other people think that they are wise, it's that they themselves think that they have wisdom to impart. And Socrates comes away thinking, you are not nearly as wise as you have convinced yourself you are, and now I've told you so. Yes?
How can he prove if they're really wise or not? Because what has to be kind of famous as?
Well, as you've seen from this dialogue itself, and as we will come to in the Republic, which will probably help answer that question, the nature of Socratic interrogation is you ask somebody a point of view, and then you push back on it, not by telling a counterpoint of view, but by asking questions and trying to probe the truth or lack of truth in what they're saying. So presumably, his investigations followed a kind of Socratic method in which you make a pronouncement, I think this, and then you say, but what about this, and what about this, and what about this? And at the end of it, if what you have initially said can no longer be sustained, then the wisdom that you have brought to bear upon the matter is compromised. In fact, we will see that at the very beginning of the Republic, this method in action, because the beginning of the Republic starts with a set of definitions about what is justice, and in each case, Socrates engages in this kind of interrogation, testing, challenging people in terms of whether what they believe to be just is true. Now, to be clear, all Socrates is saying is that, in my opinion, I don't think they're very wise, and now I've just told you so. It doesn't mean that the person he was talking to is necessarily convinced. In fact, the very fact they put him on trial suggests they remain pretty unconvinced of Socrates' opinion. But the larger point he's making is, I'm here because you hate me. The reason you hate me is because I've been going around asking you these difficult questions and telling you you're not nearly as smart as you think you are, and as a result, I have garnered this kind of negative reputation in the context of the city. Okay, some questions. Yes, in the back.
Are there any historical proofs that the oracle was right, or is just
No.
No. I'm wondering, how can someone be right about something that you don't even know is going on?
Well, and that's it's an excellent point, right? I mean, here is Socrates, who later on tells us that he believes in his own gods, but not necessarily the gods of Athens, who's using conveniently the role of the oracle to go around and engage in this kind of inquiry. I mean, it does suggest that he's poking the bear, doesn't it? But yes, I think we can safely conclude that the oracular wisdom at Delphi was not particularly scientific. Yeah.
If he felt he was not smart or wise, why did he believe he was worthy of judging other people's if they were smart or not, if they were wise?
So the judgment is simply, so if you've read the Crito, it's that kind of a thing. If I say, my belief is, and I am willing to enact laws or otherwise act on the conviction that having children creates parental moral responsibility that then justifies breaking the laws of the state, right? If that's my conviction, and I can prove to you that actually, or if I can argue in a way that may not be true, right? Then you give yourself the ability to sort of go out to sort of say, you must go and re-examine what you think, right? And I think the point about what Socrates wants to mention, and this is what we think of as when we talk about Socratic wisdom. Well, let's ask the question, what is Socratic wisdom? What's this famous phrase? The greatest wisdom you have? Yes, exactly, is the knowledge that you do not know, right? It says like, wisest is he, O men, who, like Socrates, has become aware in the truth that he is worth nothing with respect to his own wisdom. In other words, once you recognize that you have no wisdom, what can you then become? Wiser than you are, right? You may not become wise, but you will become wiser than you are. What's the main impediment to knowledge? Thinking that you already know. So, for example, if you are convinced that of the sort of moral responsibilities of parenthood, and you're not willing to push it any further, you will never come to the point that Socrates comes to, which is essentially a kind of fully fleshed consideration of the citizen as parent, the citizen as law-abider, and the like, right? So that's the idea, is that the wisdom of Socrates is that he recognizes he has no wisdom, and that makes him the wisest man. This is the examination, men of Athens, from which I have incurred many hatreds. My translation might differ slightly. And such as are most harsh and grievous, so that many prejudices have resulted from them. So people are prejudiced against him as a result of this method. And I am called a wise man. For on each occasion, those who are present think I am wise in the matters in which I confute somebody else. It's sort of like, look, you don't know anything. We've just had this long chat, and it's clear that you don't know as much as you think you do. And the guy's like, oh yeah, you think you're so smart, Socrates? Let's take this outside, put up the dukes and fight it. That kind of thing, right? There's confrontation. Is Socrates saying that he is also equally wise? No. What is he saying? He's saying, I have the wisdom to be able to see beyond what you are telling me is true. And the wisdom is to not accept it as truth, but to need to inquire as to whether it is true, right? That is the wisdom that he has. He says, but the fact is, gentlemen, right? So those who are present who think I am wise in the matters in which I confute, meaning go against somebody else. But the fact is, gentlemen, it is likely that the God is really wise, and by his oracle means this: human wisdom is of little value, right? And it appears that he does not really say this of Socrates, but merely uses my name. It's simply that I embody this principle because I am one of the people who puts this into action. And so therefore the idea is that what the oracle is telling us is, people, be like Socrates. Don't think you know the answers. Instead, have the wisdom to recognize that you are not wise, right? And once you recognize you are not wise, what do you need to therefore do? Always be skeptical, critical, asking questions, don't take anything at face value, right? In other words, it's an argument against some sort of general belief that things are a certain way without actually asking why they are that way. This is why we argue this gesture of Socratic wisdom is the foundational gesture of the Western intellectual tradition, because the Western intellectual tradition is based on the idea of what? Perpetual inquiry, skepticism, the idea that knowledge needs to be replicable, and so on. That's all coming out of the Socratic idea. And so in the first part, he says, I am on trial because, although you call me a sophist, in reality, I am the opposite of a sophist. I am the person who, instead of going around claiming wisdom and exchanging it for money, I claim no wisdom for myself. Hence, I have no money. And all I've really done is make a lot of people angry at me by pointing out that, like me, they also have no wisdom. The only difference is I recognize it and they do not. And therefore, I have made them, as he says, hateful and full of enmity. And then he adds to this, why is it therefore that you have charged me with this question of the corruption of the youth? Because this is what I teach my students. This is what I tell those people, those young people who choose to listen or to follow me. And if the method that I am teaching them is that their greatest wisdom is that they have no wisdom, as he says, they themselves often imitate me, and in turn, they attempt to examine others. So in other words, they take this method, they take this sort of point of view, attitude, and then they apply it. And so hence the notion of Socrates and his young followers are a problem, because they seem to attack a kind of established order in Athens that's simply accepted by virtue of the people who are saying it. So we might say it's an argument in favor of a kind of entrenched philosophical or intellectual skepticism at the very heart of the individual. You may know the very famous phrase that Socrates offers, the unexamined life is a life that is not worth living. And that essentially is another way of stating this same principle, that it is incumbent upon you as a human being always to examine the things around you that inform what you think to be true. Because if you fail to do so, the life you lead, as he says, is probably not worth living. So this is the first part in that section where he is explaining then why it is that people don't like him, because he's done all this bad stuff to earn a bad reputation. Yeah.
And does he explain the poets? Why?
He does have a lengthy discussion on the poets, right? For those of you, it's in 22b. He is particularly dismissive of the poets. He says that the poets essentially, he says, they say many noble things, but they know nothing of what they speak, right? That's a pretty nasty thing to say about somebody. He's like, you sound good, you don't have any idea, you have no clue what you're talking about. And I think the answer there is because what does a poet do? A poet memorizes phrases and then recites them, right? The poet is merely a mouthpiece for this kind of oral tradition that is collected. And he says, I perceive that they, the poets, felt that because they said poetry, that they were the wisest of human beings in other things in which, in fact, they had no wisdom. So yes, but he attacks all of them. I mean, it's not just poets, politicians, craftsmen. He goes after all the major groups of Athenian society. So that's the first part of the text in which he lays out then, this is why I am on trial. I am on trial because I have lived a life in a way that demonstrates to those who have power and authority that the wisdom upon which they claim that power and authority isn't really true. And no one wants to be exposed with that fact. The second element, which is that he believes in, that he has blasphemed against the gods, is not essentially that important. I will skip over it other than to note his argument is essentially, I don't believe in your Athenian gods, but I believe in other gods. And since all gods since all gods are descended from other gods, therefore this charge of blasphemy is nonsense. But I'm not going to, I will skip over that part because it's not particularly important.